So before we get into the specifics of the discussion section relative to this particular study, I wanted to just place in context of what I believe the purpose of the discussion section is. So when authors present a discussion section, oftentimes what they are trying to do is they're trying to interpret and come to some conclusion regarding the results of their study. And I don't just necessarily mean the numeric results of their study, but they are coming to a conclusion about that, but they're also placing their numeric values of their study in context relative to the strengths and limitations of the study design that they use to analyze, to come up with the data for the study and to analyze this data for the study. The other thing that the other purpose of the discussion section is to put into context their findings relative to the other literature and the other studies that have been done. Now, as an expert, I typically don't spend as much time on the discussion section as I did when I was novice or when I was learning about epidemiology. And partly the reason that I don't spend as much time on it now is because one of the big things that I just said is the purpose is to interpret their findings and their results in context of their strengths and limitations of their study design. As an expert now, oftentimes when I was reading, or as you may have observed, when I was reading the method section and reading the results section, I was reading those sections with a critical eye to discover what are those strengths and limitations of that particular study design or that particular method, and I came to some idea of how that might affect the results. And so therefore, because I spent so much time in the methods and results section identifying those strengths and limitations, I don't necessarily rely on the author's stated limitations and strengths before I come to my own conclusion. Okay. So, now we're going to move on to the specifics of this particular discussion section. The first thing the authors do is they interpret the results. That's right here. I want to make sure that they interpret the results in the same way that I had interpreted the results, and if I look here, we observed that frequent fried food consumption was significantly associated with the risk of type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease. These associations remain significant after extensive adjustment for a certain set of confounding variables. And that's the same conclusion that I came to. Again, there are a little bit of differences between type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease, and there might also be a few differences between away from home consumption versus at-home consumption of fried food. In the second paragraph, the authors place their results in context of other findings. And so this was one of the other major purposes of the discussion section. And what they say is that this is consistent with some findings, including the Black Women's Health Study, Singapore Chinese Health Study, and coronary artery risk development in young adult study. Essentially, we never want, and the reason this is important is we never, as epidemiologists, take the results from one study and come to some conclusion about the exposure-outcome relationship and say, because it was found in one particular study, we know this must be true. As epidemiologists, we want to make sure there is consistency across different studies and across different populations. And just inherently, when you're thinking about the names of these studies, the Black Women's Health Study, Singapore Chinese Health Study, and Young Adult Study. These are 3 different study designs, and there are 3 different types of population, so that people are observing these results are consistent with other literature. This skill of placing your study results in context of other literature is a skill that you will need to develop and do consistently throughout the semester as you are examining studies for your project. So if I continue to move on to paragraph 3, again they point out the differences between fried food away from home and at home. And again, what they're pointing out here is a term in epidemiology, we use biologic plausibility. Does it make sense with what we know scientifically about how oils might behave if they're at home versus away from home. And the reason it's important to understand this biological plausibility, just because there is an association between an exposure and an outcome doesn't necessarily mean that the exposure caused the outcome. For example, if you said there's an association between physical activity and depression, we don't know which one preceded the other one.